Hello and welcome everybody to our new installment of Karger in Conversation. I am Francesca Brazzarotto, the Customer Engagement Manager at Karger and the organizer of this event. The panel discussion today is titled Breaking Boundaries, is Open Access Truly Open to All? And I'm particularly excited because we truly have a fantastic lineup of speakers joining us from the US, the UK and Spain. For those of you who haven't attended before, this series is a quarterly occurrence, bringing together experts from the publishing industry, librarians, information specialists, funders, and researchers worldwide. The aim is to discuss the latest trends and topics in scholarly publishing. You can see the link to our page here, where you can find our previous panels and where you can also keep up to date with future events. The next one will be in June. Today's topic is quite a polarizing one. We'll explore if open access is fully meeting its objectives or if it's just skimming the surface. Our panel will navigate beyond traditional open access talk, addressing its role in making research not only available, but also understandable to anyone and to everybody. We'll also aim to uncover how open access can truly bridge the divide between expert knowledge and public reach. Our goal today is to equip you with all the ideas to shape the next steps for a more inclusive and comprehensible scientific future. Before we dive in, a bit of housekeeping. This event will be recorded and made available to you afterwards. With over 250 people registering from across the globe, we are really, really happy. We just want to ensure that those who couldn't attend today or can only partially attend today can watch it later on at their own convenience. So feel free to drop any questions you might have in the chat or the question box that you will see on the right hand side, and then we'll monitor them and address them at the end. And lastly, you'll receive an email from us today right after the event, allowing you to share your feedback. But most importantly, you can advise us on topics that you'd like us to cover next time, and let us know if you'd like to be a speaker. I'm always on the lookout for speakers, so please come and join us. So now let me introduce today's moderator, Karger's head of academic and research market, Chris Box, and let's ignite a dialogue that shapes tomorrow's reality. Chris, over to you.
All right, thanks, Fran. Welcome everyone from me as well. As Fran said, I'm going to moderate the session. I'll introduce it in a moment. Just before I do that, Fran, I think we've got a poll that we were going to launch just before the starts. So Fran will launch that. If you have a moment to capture that, it would be interesting. Okay, but let me introduce the session. So anyone involved in the scholarly communications world will know that open access has been one of, if not the dominating theme in the landscape over the last 10 to 15 years. A transition to a fully open environment, whilst challenging, would offer significant benefits in advancing research and as a result for the wider world. And there have been countless debates on this, countless discussions. I'm sure many of you have attended many different webinars over the years on this, and you will have a different opinion on the rate of progress, no doubt. But we're going to try and talk about a different angle today, and we're really interested to discuss this with the group. So, amongst many points put forward to promote the transition to open, one key theme has been that the taxpayer should have a right to access the outputs of publicly funded research. This is a point that's been expressed by many national funders around the world, and perhaps in recent times it was reasonably strongly reinforced by the Nelson memo published by the OSTP in the United States, which described their policy, I think initially as a public access policy rather than an open access policy. But I think the aim of public access really goes beyond a right. This should be about trying to democratize science. And as well as having a right to access that published research, the ultimate goal should be that the research can be used to help improve the public understanding of science, increase the public trust in science, and both of those things could be greater enabled by having greater access to that research. And as a result, open access and public access to some extent have become in some way intertwined, and some people might say inextricably linked. But as anyone will know that's read a research article or a journal article at least, that providing access in isolation is unlikely to engage the wider public. In fact, there's perhaps a real risk in saying we've made it free, go read, and presenting them with a journal article that it could reduce rather than increase the public trust in research. And that really raises the key question that we wanted to talk about today, which is open access truly open to all? So, what we're not trying to do here is question the general ambition of open access at all, but it's to ask ourselves the question of whether it's currently on a pathway to achieve that goal of the democratization of science that it potentially promises. I think this is quite a big and quite a wide-ranging topic, but one that has quite a virtuous goal, I think. And to try to approach this, we're going to try and talk about a number of different questions today, some of which are from a principle perspective and some of which from a practical perspective. And really broadly, those questions we're going to think about is, well, firstly, should open access and public access be linked at all? What do we even mean when we say public access and open access? And if they are linked, are current policies in open access delivering enough to achieve the wider goal of public access, which might be about improving the public trust in science? And in relation to that, how do we even measure this? Secondly, I think if we aren't on the right pathway, what are the barriers to achieving this, and how might we overcome those barriers both now and in the future? And we're going to explore, I think, some success stories that are currently in the landscape as well to give some cases around that. And lastly, I think is this question about who should be responsible for ensuring that research is accessible to the public. And I think accessible could be a choice word within that as well. So I think these are quite complicated topics. There's probably as many questions as answers, but we're really delighted to have a panel of experts to start helping us explore this question today. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as well. But on that note, let me introduce the speakers that will be joining us today. So first we have Dr. Beth Montague-Hallen. Beth started off academic life as a molecular biologist studying at Manchester University. The next 14 years were spent as a bioinformatician, accruing an MSc and a PhD on the way. Following this, Beth decided that supporting others to do excellent research was far more rewarding than actually doing the research itself, and so moved into libraries and research support. Beth has worked as a research support librarian in several different universities and is now the head of Library and Information Services at the Francis Crick Institute in the UK. She takes an open as possible, EDI-focused approach to research support and is a big advocate for Green OA, alongside a completely transparent recycle, including radically open data and software sharing. So welcome, Beth. Next, we have Roger Schonfeld. Roger is the Vice President of Organisational Strategy for Ithaca and of Ithaca S&R's Libraries, Scholarly Communication and Museums programme. Roger and the team conduct research and provide advisory services to drive evidence-based innovation and leadership to foster research, learning and preservation. This has included extensive survey and qualitative research on faculty members and students, as well as leaders such as senior research officers, presidents and provosts, and the directors of libraries and museums. Roger served on a number of industry boards and has testified in front of the US House of Representatives on government policy, advocating for strong approaches to digital preservation. In addition to dozens of research reports that he's published, as well as articles, briefing papers, and a number of books, he also blogs regularly on the Scholarly Quick Kitchen and is a frequenter of Twitter, or do we say X? I'm never really sure whether I'm changing the name of that, but certainly one or other. Next, we have Dr. Sarah Vetstad. Sarah is a microbiologist turned science writer and communicator, publishing for professional associations and life science organisations. She runs the blog Bacterial World to share the diverse and colourful activities of microbes and bacteria, and Sunny Scientists to support researchers in their busy scientific days. As Science Communication Manager for the Scientific Panel on Responsible Plant Nutrition and Blog Post Commissioner for the FEMS Microbe blog, Sarah writes about microbiology, environmental and plant nutrition research for expert and non-expert audiences. And to coach and mentor scientists in science communication, she co-founded the partnership business SciComm Society. And previous to that career, she gained her PhD at Imperial College and a postdoc at CSIC in Granada, Spain. And our final panelist we have is Dr. Hannah Hope, who's the open research lead within the research environment team at the Wellcome Trust. Her work cuts across Wellcome's strategy, supporting Wellcome's ambition that the research it funds and the processes by which it do this are open, engaged, ethical and efficient. She's responsible for a portfolio of research funding policies and infrastructure grants that aim to create more open research ecosystem. Since her PhD in cell biology, Hannah's been interested in how science is communicated and for what purposes. She worked in scholarly publishing and public engagement prior to joining Wellcome. So we finished with the word welcome. So I'll say welcome again to all of our speakers, and then just based on the bios, I think we've got a really great panel to discuss this topic today. So just to start the conversation then, I'd like to try and sort of set the scene a bit by getting a sense of how our panelists feel about open access and public access. From your perspective, do you see them as the same thing, or are they completely different? Perhaps even to ask the question another way, we could say, are the intentions of open access and public access the same? Roger, perhaps we could come to you first with this. I wonder if you might be able to give us some sense of definition around these. What do you think is generally meant by open access and public access in conversations within the scholarly communications ecosystem?
Well, thanks so much for the opportunity to participate today in this terrific conversation and with such a great group of peers. It seems to me that open access is really a term that comes from the research itself. So it comes sort of from within research facing outward. By contrast, I see public access as really coming from the public, asking for a certain set of justifications for policy intervention. So in other words, open access is a question of what researchers should do with their ecosystem, whereas public access is a question about what the public needs, wants, and would benefit from. I think it's fair to say that open access might be a necessary step on the road to public access. I also think it's possible to achieve public access in the way that I mean it anyway, without providing open access. Public access for me is about certain forms of impact on society. And I think there's reasons to question, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk about this, whether open access really has all of those impacts that we'd like, that many of us anyway would hope to see. So I hope that provides some opening thinking.
That's great, yeah, and I guess what you're touching on there is that open access could be an enabler for public access, but it might not be a complete requirement for public access, let's say. But maybe just one sort of slight follow-up question on that might seem like a strange question, but when people say public access, I think you've touched on that. I think you've touched on this already to some extent, but what do you think they mean when they say public, and what do you think they mean when they say access? I'm thinking that question makes sense. I think when we say public, people have different interpretations of what that might mean, and I was just interested in your perspectives on when you've heard that phrase used, what they're referring to in terms of public and what they're referring to in terms of access.
Well, I mean, there's probably different people with different meanings, but if you look at the Nelson memo itself, and therefore the US policy guidance on the topic here in the United States, the intended beneficiary of expanded public access is the American public. And the goal is to allow all Americans to benefit from the returns on our research and development investments without delay. So, there's all sorts of different ways to benefit from research investments. And I think the question is, what does it take for the public to benefit from those?
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, great. I think that's a really nice opening definition. Perhaps we could come to you next. I mean, you're a practicing information professional at a world-leading research institution with a heavy focus on open. I'm just interested to get your views, either on a general perspective or from a day-to-day perspective, how you see those concepts as related or not.
Yeah, absolutely. So open access is a massive part of what I do. Public access, less so. So I agree a lot with some of the things that Roger said there about, open access is coming from the researchers. It's something they're often required to do, by funders or institutions. And it's about making what they are experts in, using their expert language, available to other experts, which I think is a very different goal to translating that to allow the general public to understand it. I think the other thing that is important to think about when we're having this conversation is what do we mean by the public? Because I think those open access outputs actually are really useful for some members of the public. So if you think about doctors in general practice, architects, scientists in industry, all of those people actually want that level of detail, detailed research outputs. However, your average guy on the street who wants to know about science but doesn't have any science training probably can't access that journal article without some sort of intermediary. And I think that's really, you know, we have a science communication professional with us here today. I think that intermediary person is a really important part of the process, because, you know, researchers can make their outputs open access without having to do much more than they do normally in their everyday science process. But translating that to allow a non-specialist to understand it, that's a whole nother level of skills. And I'm not convinced we need to be asking the same people to do both of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a few really interesting things you've just said there, certainly. I mean, I guess one thing that both of you are saying is that open access, the phrase open access to people outside of the research community is probably kind of irrelevant. You know, it's something that, or lacking in purpose, really. The research community and people involved in scholarly communications will know what that means, and it has particular definitions, or perhaps we'll come on to that also in a minute. But I think this question, yeah, about who we mean when we say the public, and, you know, you've captured there, let's say practitioners, if you like, rather than researchers, as a difference from the person on the street, you know, which we tend to practice when we think about what the public means. But I guess your point is that the public benefits from the practitioner having access, regardless of whether the person on the street can actually.
Absolutely. If a doctor can read the newest research about whatever the disease is that someone has, that's much more important usually than the person with the disease being able to access the paper. They might benefit from somebody explaining it in lay terms to them, but that's where that doctor in the middle comes in. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Hannah, perhaps we might come to you next. I mean, I guess as working for a research funder, you almost think about the research cycle from a different place, you know, before the research has even started, let's say. And I just wonder how those sort of concepts appeal to you and how you think about those.
Yeah, so we at least in terms of at Wellcome, we're not always thinking at the upstream. You know, as an organisation, we want research to improve those most at need. So actually we are thinking at the translation end, and it's like, what do we need to commission to get those impacts? So, you know, I think Beth has made this point already. You know, actually we're thinking about what are the diverse groups of people that need to benefit from the research, and how does that need to be shared? I think, you know, Beth made the point very well around how actually it's the intermediaries that are very key. You know, making the research articles that we funded open or the reports that we've commissioned is just the first step of that process. And actually, I think to go to Roger's point around, you know, those public returns on investments that are more diverse than just reading a journal article, those are also angles that we're thinking about in that translation. Reading is one element of achieving impact, but it's kind of the easy part almost.
Right. So I guess what you're describing there then is that the both public access and open access are things that might be important levers to create the impacts that you're looking for from your research. You start, or the research that you're looking to fund, but you start in the first instance with the impact that you're looking to generate and almost work back from there about what we might be required to achieve that.
Yeah, certainly for strategic priorities. That's less the case when we're kind of doing, I guess, open mode or discovery research, where we're, you know, it's very much led by researchers' ideas. But for the areas where we want to see specific impacts, which for our organisation is in infectious diseases, mental health, and climate and health, we are thinking about that kind of impact lens first, and then working backwards.
Okay, great. Maybe I might just ask you one follow-up question as well, if you don't mind, similar to the question which we were touching on from public access perspective, but I'm kind of interested that you're the open research lead. I'm just wondering if you have a kind of like definition for what you mean by open. You know, is there something maybe that's a kind of big question, but what exactly would that look like for you, and perhaps how you give yourself a tick to feel that you've achieved that open goal, if you like?
So for me, openness is a tool that can achieve different outcomes. Sometimes openness achieves that peer-to-peer, expert-to-expert communication, and that's making a research article openly available. Other times, the openness actually is ensuring that all of our application processes are publicly available on our website so that anyone that applies to Wellcome has the same information. So then we're using openness as a tool for equality and enabling equity. Other times I might be thinking about open from an impact angle. So is it more advantageous to have a patent on a piece of product or to license it for reuse in the case of open software? So there is no predefined tick on what it looks like. It's very context specific. And we have a range of lenses that we apply to when we're being successful across our work. And that's really where the broader research environment angle of it's about the equality, the ethics, it's about the engagement, bringing that all together to enable the research to be impactful.
Okay, that's really interesting. And yeah, that word equality, I think, is quite interesting, because one of the things I sometimes fear, certainly in scholarly communication industry, is that when we talk about open access, we're talking about a kind of strict definition where we're talking about the paywall and we're talking about the reuse rights, I think. But I think what you're describing there is open as a much broader term. And, you know, on the kind of equality front, I guess from the general public's perspective, there is this barrier that says there's a kind of prior requirement for higher knowledge, let's say. And so if we aren't able to try and break that down to some extent, then we have, you know, a lack of equality in the use of that research, particularly where it might be publicly funded. But Sarah, maybe you might also be able to touch, I mean, you come from I'm sure you're very familiar with the concepts of open access, but from a practical perspective, you focus more on public access, let's say, as a science communicator. But how do you see those two phrases? Do you see them as interchangeable? Do you see them as related or not related at all?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thank you. They're definitely very tightly related, linked to each other, of course. I mean, for me, when I left research and when I left the academic world, I obviously lost my access via my university library, so I did not have the access to all the journals anymore, which means I was suffering from lack of open access, obviously. But then as a science communicator, I'm more, or like, I want to focus more on the public access of like making scientific knowledge accessible or engaging for people that do not have that scientific background. So yeah, that's, for me, that's the big two concepts right there.
Yeah. And you used like a really nice word for us there, I think, which is accessible, you know, where access can easily be a shortcut to thinking about paywalls, whereas accessible, I think, gives that broader thinking about how, you know, everyone might be able to engage with that. So, okay, I think that gives us a good kind of reflection on how those different terms might be interchangeable. We can probably kind of reflect on the fact that there's some relationship there, I think everyone says, to some extent, but they're not necessarily tightly coupled, and one could be an enabler of the other. But there is a sort of delineation between what those two different things are. I guess one other point that was kind of highlighted as cross from everyone there really was the difference between something being accessible to someone without that specialist knowledge, you know. So perhaps it just reinforces this point that something that's open access makes it available to everyone, but not perhaps accessible to all. Okay, so let's try and move on a bit now. I think this was to try and get a sense of where we are now, just before we start to move into some more sort of practical questions, which I think is the really sort of interesting area within this. But I think trying to get a sense of where we are now is quite difficult because, you know, in contrast to open access, where we can look at things like the number of articles that are published or proportion of articles that are published in open access and the use of reuse, I think it's difficult to get a sense of what public access is being created from research, let's say. But I'm interested to try and get a sense from any of you to what extent you think the open access movement has fulfilled any promise of making scholarly content accessible to a global and particularly to a diverse audience. Do we think that current open access initiatives are doing enough to fulfill the promise of democratizing knowledge, particularly where taxpayers are involved? Hannah, I wonder if maybe we might come to you first on this question. I know that Wellcome isn't a taxpayer-funded organisation. I don't think, anyway. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But I guess
No.
is very much a kind of someone that's interested in benefits for the general public or for humankind in general, let's say. But I don't know if as an organisation, set yourselves any goals in trying to get a sense of this particular topic and how well you think we're moving along that goal.
Yeah, thanks. So no, we are we're not a tax-funded organisation. We're a philanthropy, and we do not have a living donor, which I think is often quite important to distinguish between the philanthropic organisations. So we have, since we first started having open access policies, we've made a huge volume of knowledge accessible globally to audience. How this compares to the access levels of our research when it was behind a subscription paywall, that's not easy for me to tell as someone who wasn't on the other side of those paywalls at that point in time. But certainly from the knowledge that we have at our fingertips in terms of who is accessing our research in terms of, for example, open access books, the scale of access is enormous, and as is the global spread of them. And what we know from some of our research institutions who have run data access repositories and look at who is requesting the data, they are seeing global reach of their data, and they're also seeing a lot of requests, for example, from students. So they're not necessarily that expert to expert communication. They are that kind of next generation of researchers potentially. So I think, when we think about open access or public access, there's a huge value, educational value to the accessibility of this information, and in making that knowledge and data more widely available previously. Just one thing that I wanted to kind of highlight, because I don't want to take up too much time. When you talk about democratizing knowledge, I think there is a kind of key, democratization shouldn't only work in one way. So if we want to democratize access to knowledge, then as researchers and as funders, we need to be willing to involve members of the public in terms of informing what research questions are asked. So, I think there is a kind of, we might want to make knowledge more accessible for broader benefit and learning and gain. I think engagement in informing research priorities is really, really important. If we're seeking for, different organizations involved in this process are going to have different levels of appetite in terms to allow the public to inform their research priorities. And so I think that's kind of like a separate tension that we can probably park for this conversation, but I just wanted to flag it that, it's not just a one way, here's our knowledge, you should trust us, this is what we think is important element to it. So yeah, I'll end there.
I think that's a really interesting point, actually. Yeah. So it's saying, if we haven't asked the people in the first instance the things which are important to them, then we shouldn't necessarily expect that they should be interested in the outputs that come out, because it might not be those things that are a priority for them. And so I guess it really gets across that point, is it's the overall system which is interesting, not how our lives are improving in general, rather than thinking about on an individual experiment or an individual basis, if we want to get that bigger picture with public involvement optimized.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. And like in my own experience engagement experience. You know, relevance to individuals' life is a real key prioritization factor for if and how they choose to engage in that scientific knowledge. And so I think when we are reflecting on, you know, public topics, big topics such as public understanding of science or trust in science, you know, we need to be careful in terms of, or mindful in terms of who we're engaging in, because those that are most likely to engage in this are people who have a prior interest. But equally, we, you know, particularly on that case of trust in science, we need to be mindful of actually how much science is trustful.
Right.
You know, there's big conversations within research at the moment around the level of misconduct, which has huge varieties of scales in terms of misconduct. And there are many examples in history where science and scientists have not been trustful nor respectful of communities and populations at varying degrees of scale. So, you know, I think we just need to tread carefully when we are reflecting on some of these topics, and particularly when we go on to the next session, thinking about, you know, how can you change some of these things.
Yeah, okay, great. No, that's really interesting. Sorry to just ask one more question on this, perhaps, because it's just quite interesting, but could you give us a sense of the kind of conversations you have upstream with the general public? Are there kind of like focus groups that you use, or perhaps that's maybe information that's you might not be as involved in, but it's just interesting the way that you describe that kind of upstream information, really, which gives a sense of what the priorities might be. I'm just curious to know what kind of things that might look like.
Yeah, so it varies by research program. You know, Wellcome's strategy is set by Wellcome, but in terms of individual research projects and research priorities or research questions that take place, those have different levels of engagement. So, for example, our mental health program, they have lived experience advisors, and they're involved in decision making within the programs in terms of what research is funded, how lived engagement is a kind of core part of every project that we fund. We have a community engagement team that work a lot with our institutions based, well, actually all of our institutions, whether they're based in the UK or in other parts of the world, that focus on engaging the institution's local community in the institution's work is almost like a kind of, you know, right to be there. You know, we are a big part of your community. This is a transparency angle. It's kind of there as a legitimacy, you know, to explain why we're present in those situations. Then down to a kind of individual project research grant level, we ask that all our researchers engage with the stakeholders that are important for their research. So if they're doing research into a particular disease, they should engage individuals with those illnesses to help identify whether the research questions that they're asking are the questions that matter to them. And that engagement should translate through to the outputs in terms of how they are sharing those outputs, whether it's to a scientific audience or actually to a patient audience, or probably in most cases it's both.
Okay, all right, great. Now, I think I really want to dig into that other topic which you raised, which was about the trust of the original research in the first instance, if you like, rather than necessarily something that we then translate to the public. But I think perhaps we'll come on to that in the next topic, because that's perhaps one of the barriers to really engaging the public. Sarah, I'm just interested from your perspective when thinking about this sense of how far we've come on the kind of public engagement spectrum. I mean, at a kind of micro level, if you like, when you're working with individual researchers, how much do you sort of see that public engagement piece is at the forefront of their mind, if you like, and how much of it is something which they're comfortable with? I don't know if you could give us a sense of that from your general communications or your general work with researchers.
Yeah, do you have another hour? No, it's definitely very varied. I get the whole spectrum. I see scientists who are really, really active, really motivated and engaged in bringing their science, their research out to other people, be it other scientists within the field or just a bit outside the field. Some of them are very active, for example, when there's universities open, what do you call it, like open days, when universities are just sharing their science. They're super engaged and super motivated, and they like interacting with the people and with kids and explain them really nicely, really well, really accessibly what's going on in their research labs. And then I get scientists who I ask them, hey, can you maybe just summarize your research paper to a non-expert audience? And what they do is basically they just shorten the abstract, and it's like, there you go. I'm like, I'm sorry, this is not what I'm asking you for. This is not helpful. And they don't even realize that. I guess they're just so within their own field, within their own scientific community, within their mind, that they don't even think, or like they lack the skills often to, you know, translate that knowledge into a different language for non-scientists, for non-experts from their field. So yeah, you got everything as always.
I guess like it's not something which is necessarily part of the training to become a researcher, and so something might be natural to you, it might be not natural to you in the way that any of us might be more comfortable or not communicating in different audiences.
Yes, and also, I mean, it's a form of passion. Obviously, I understand if scientists really like talking details, talking all the technical stuff with other scientists, like, you know, talking about the small things. I can completely understand that if they don't care, not they care, but they don't like putting stuff into the big picture and talk to kids and, you know, explain the research in really easy ways, or like having the patience to talk really simple and explain it like 3 or 4 times to someone who just doesn't get it right away. So it's obviously, it's also a question of that, like just personality wise.
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Okay, we looked there on a micro level. Roger, I know that you've followed particularly policies, and obviously, I mean, I know you will follow global policies, but you'll probably be quite familiar with US policies as well. And you mentioned about the Nelson memo earlier on that particularly referred to public access. Do you have a sense from that about what kind of measures they've put in place to try and see if they're achieving their goals, and how they'll know if they're, you know, achieving the goals that we expect at that stage? Or I'm not aware that there's a kind of empirical measure, but perhaps you might be aware of something different there.
Yeah, I'm not aware of very much there, and I have to say that you know, it seems to me that in the U.S. The policymaking process has used a public access rationale to promote what is basically an open access set of policies, at least up until this point. I'm not saying that critically or negatively, but just observing that there does seem to be a disjuncture there. And, you know, perhaps just reflecting on some of the comments of the other panelists over the last few minutes, I might add just 1 or 2 things, which is that I think the comments that I think it was Hannah who offered first about trust in science are extremely well taken. You know, we've seen a collapse in the trust in science, you know, certainly in a number of countries, if not globally, at the very same time that open access has taken hold. And I'm certainly not suggesting that there's a causal relationship between those two, not at all. Though at the same time, I do think we have to recognize that there are trade-offs in some of the policies that we've implemented in some of the countries that panelists here represent, in the sense that there are risks to positive public impact from open access. And I really do want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the idea that more open access it simply leads unquestionably to more positive public benefit, because we can cite very specific cases. Certainly, I regret to have to say in my own political context here in the US, where open access and in the UK, or no, in the US, I want to focus on where open access, you know, has come at the heart of efforts to undermine trust in science. And you know, even beyond that, I think we can come up with anecdotes very, very specifically where individual patients or family member Googling a particular medical condition or disease has come up with articles, open access articles, that are meant as part of a scholarly conversation or conversation among practitioners that were never intended to provide advice for a patient or a loved one, and have been misused or misapprehended and have directly contributed to reduced trust in medical practitioners, et cetera. So I just want us to kind of recognize that there's a tension as we're trying to navigate away from a closed system and towards an increasingly open system, that we need to be able to bear all of those kinds of factors in mind. And I don't mean to suggest that it's easy or simple or anything like that. I think we're all doing the very best we can, but I think we're also seeing some of the blowback in some cases as well. And I think as you ask about like U.S. public access policy making, I think there's a real need, certainly in our context, to better address some of those dynamics with more sophistication.
Yeah, I feel like Hannah's poised to say something, so I'm gonna. Am I right?
I did want to, but first I'm conscious that I've spoken quite a bit. So if any of the others want to come in first, please do.
That's fine. You go ahead, Hannah.
Okay.
Yeah,
no, I think you are right. There has, in some of your overall point there, Roger, that trust in science is something that has shifted negatively in recent years. I think it'd be quite hard to say whether open access is causation or correlation. I mean, equally during this time, there's been a huge rise in general coverage of science. Not all of that has been positive. There's been many sort of historic, a lot of history of science has been published that has uncovered some of the darker sides of historical research, and the biases that promoted and the poor ethical practice. But I think, to come to your point that you made around the risks associated with individuals reading articles that were not meant to be taken on an individual basis, but were actually supposed to be viewed as part of a wider body, and so maybe that is not current practice, or actually it's past practice. I think there is maybe something that was missed by open access is focused on original research. There's a huge value in reviews that kind of summarize bodies of literature, and those have historically been excluded from open access policies. And I think in hindsight that may not have been a supportive decision, thinking both in terms of general access and public access, or educational access and value there. So I think that is one angle where, while the initial focus was perhaps widely justified, thinking going forwards, then actually there is broader value in having more of that summative literature made openly available.
Yeah, and I guess what's really coming across there is that we know that let's call it restoring public trust in science. Then, if we see that it's had a kind of a difficult time recently, isn't easy, and I think just saying something like public access, we know won't be enough to try and restore that public trust in science. And there are lots of things that will need to come together in order to work towards that, whether it's the things which are about making things more available, but I think also some of the points you were touching on, Hannah, about engaging the public at an early stage and making sure that the things which are being focused on are the things which feel relevant to those people, or at least try to help them to understand why they're relevant to them. And then there's this other point, which I guess you were touching on there, Roger, is that unfortunately there will be some people in the world which see a value in trying to challenge the trust in science, let's say, or actually kind of almost work against it. And all of those things create quite a difficult problem. But having said that, I mean, I think we probably know that there are some really good examples of where we have started to overcome some of these things. And I wonder if we might move on a bit now, just to start to talk about, how we might make science speak to everyone, and this was really perhaps thinking about, firstly, what some of the barriers might be. I think we've probably touched on some of these already, actually, but I think we know already that there's the issue in terms of the understanding of science, but Roger, maybe we might just come back to you now again then, and just to think about, I know you've written some interesting pieces on some of the challenges with public access. Perhaps you could just give us a description of all of those barriers which you see at the moment, but also be really interested to understand some kind of ways that you've seen of people overcoming those barriers.
Yeah, I've already spoken about some of them, so I won't try to repeat myself. But I think fundamentally, the barriers fall into several categories. There's a barrier in which, as Hannah was pointing out, I think very nicely, not everyone can really distill or synthesize these original research articles into usable knowledge. I think there's another barrier, which is very few members of the general public can truly establish the trustworthiness and authority of information resources, particularly given how much misinformation we encounter, and indeed given how much pollution there is in the scholarly record, how much pollution there has been in the scholarly record just even in the last few years. I'd hate to suggest that something, just because it's published in a so-called peer-reviewed journal, is therefore something that someone should find trustworthy today. We have a real crisis right now in that publishers are stepping up to trying to address, and some academic institutions are as well. So I think those are some of the factors that are at play. Now, when I think there's a huge opportunity to build tools and systems that will distill and synthesize trusted information resources for whether it be for the practitioners that we were speaking about before, those architects and physicians and so forth, or whether it's for members of the general public that would be situated within the kinds of workflows that people actually use to discover and access the kind of information that they're looking for. I think there's a dream that a lot of people have right now that there's some kind of AI that's going to do all of that for us by tomorrow. But my view is that there's still an important role for expert science communicators, and curatorial work and so forth. It feels to me that that we don't have nearly as much of that taking place with sensitivity to the actual nature of how science works. So I'll give you a very specific example. I had a chance to talk to a science journalist from one of the most prestigious newspapers in the world a year or so ago, and he was explaining to me that he's perfectly comfortable quoting scientists on areas that he knows they have no expertise on, simply because they're scientists. And he was very explicit that policy matters that they have no particular knowledge of the economic costs or trade-offs on are exactly the kinds of things that he wants a scientist to speak to. And I think that we have to hold not just science accountable, which I've already spoken about in the science ecosystem, but also the communicators and journalists, that they need to help us distinguish between who are the experts at what, and how do we really center that on actual expertise. So when we're talking about policy, we should be talking to policy experts, not laboratory scientists, and so forth like that. And so I just think there's a lot of honestly, a lot of cases where a journalist or a scientist is following an economic incentive that the current system has provided for them, whether it's to get more clicks or get more publications or get, whatever, impact factor, whatever it may be, rather than going for what is the thing that the public most needs out of the work that I'm doing. And I think we all need to hold ourselves accountable to do better there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess you know, the aspect of trust there that we're talking about, you know, I guess we can say from the public's perspective, finding this stuff now is not really an issue, in the sense that, you know, what's happened with the internet has mean that, you know, one word in a Google search will give you results. The issue is, how do you know whether you can trust those? And, you know, there's a question of whether they were right in the first place, but also whether there's been an incentive for people to present those in a different way, which then makes it even more challenging for someone to be able to understand if they can't trust that. And there's a challenge there, isn't the language is difficult, but then just the understanding of whether you can trust that or not is quite challenging. But Beth, I'm just wondering now, thinking about your, you know, librarians, I guess, have always been seen as custodians of trusted information, you know, and that's one of the foundations, I guess, of the library. And I don't know how much you kind of think about this topic. I know public access is not necessarily your primary focus, and as you say, it was more about research support, but I'm presuming some of the things that people have said here will probably touch quite closely on things that you think about, and I'm just interested to get your perspective on some of those points and about the barriers that we've been talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that's important to think about in terms of kind of trust and open access and public access is kind of how the outputs are being presented. So I think the public probably doesn't have much of a perception of the difference between different types of journals. You know, the difference between something where a journal is very specific about it's got to be extremely high quality and also very on topic, compared to something where they'll publish it providing it is technically correct, or a preprint where it hasn't even been through review. And I think, you know, the differences between that kind of publishing is a very technical landscape, and the public is very unlikely to understand that. I think then you also get the difference between kind of curation, where, you know, a journal is curating for one sort of reason, whereas, say, a green institutional repository is curating for another reason. You know, everything that is in this repository comes out of our institution. So, for example, you know, everything that is in the Francis Crick Institution, I would, you know, trust and say, I believe that all of this is high quality work, because, you know, that's what we do. But librarians are not looking at that work and saying, oh yes, absolutely, this comes over a bar, this is maybe, you know, less high quality. It's just, yes, it was published by our institution. And for very large institutions, there's literally no way that librarians could possibly be experts in all of those fields that come in. And I think, you know, that's one of the really big challenges for librarians in terms of this, that we do have to rely on lots of other people. You know, we have to rely on journals, we have to rely on metrics and things like that, because it's just not possible for us to be experts. You know, I feel very lucky in that my previous career as a scientist now meshes very well with running the library at the Francis Crick Institute, because I actually do understand the research. But many of the people in my team don't come from that world. My open access librarian, I couldn't possibly ask her to even do something like create a lay summary of the abstracts that come across her desk, because she doesn't have that technical knowledge. So in the Crick, we have other teams that will do that. And that's partly because, well, for those of you who don't know, we are jointly funded by Medical Research Council, Cancer Research UK, and Wellcome, where Hannah's from. And so when we were built, public access was baked into the Francis Crick Institute. So, you know, we have a very good outward communications team. We have an events team which put on discovery days and all of this sort of thing to allow the public to understand our research. But universities probably only have the same resource we do for maybe 10, 20 times the number of researchers. And I think we don't put enough resource into that sort of thing, and that actually if it's what the public wants, if it's what the government wants, if, you know, policies are going to be prioritizing public access, then, you know, there needs to be a bit more money put behind it. We need to be, you know, funding the training of experts in that area, because it is a, you know, it's a highly skilled area.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, I guess it's quite interesting what you describe about Francis Crick as being a relatively new institution. I'm thinking compared to universities, some universities anyway, but as the public has almost been at your foundation in the sense that from the start that's been a requirement for you, whereas perhaps for others it's something which there is a newer, something that perhaps is newer, let's say. And you know, it's interesting, you know, when we use phrases like preprints, as you say, or I think it was Hannah that mentioned about review articles. I mean, as a group, we'll all know what those are, but there's no reason why people should understand why a preprint might not be as trusted as a journal article, and how that differs from a review article if you're not, you're not commonly using this kind of information. And you know, you really touched on there nicely, I think, the point around the expertise. I mean, Sarah, this is your expertise really is in science communication, and yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to understand a bit about how you go about this in practice and some examples of where you've seen this to be successful, if you like, particularly taking into account some of the points that have been raised there, I think, which is around establishing that trust, you know, how you can make something trustworthy and kind of reliable amongst the kind of a world of noise, let's say, where there's so much information out there in general. So yeah, I mean, really interested to understand from a practical perspective, and really some use cases would be really interesting for us as well, I think.
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, lots of things in my head going on right now. So let's think. One practical use case I can talk about is the FEMS that you mentioned at the beginning, which is the Federation of European Microbiology Societies that I'm working for. And so what they do, they publish scientific journals within about microbiology topics, and they are an organization that wants to disseminate knowledge of microbiology topics. So they started a blog about their research papers, and that's why they brought me in as a commissioner for that blog. So what I'm doing is I come up with these like blog posts about research papers together with the scientists. So that's what I said at the beginning. I asked them to, hey, can you summarize your research for a broader audience? And then depending on what they bring me, what they submit to me, or like what kind of draft they give me, I have more or less work to do to make it really accessible to not just other microbiologists, but also to, you know, other scientists or policymakers. And this works quite well, as in we've seen that those publications that appear on our blog or that were promoted on the blog had a higher citation number, higher citation index, that the researchers got asked or got contacted more by other scientists about collaboration, just because, you know, their word got out, they got more known in the field as well. So other scientists, other microbiologists could more trust them in the sense of, hey, this person knows what they're talking about. So that is like one, call it case study, where I see it's working. We help bring the microbiology knowledge out to the people. I mean, this blog is not necessarily for the public in the sense of non-experts. It's more for microbiologists from all the fields, but it's already, we've seen the numbers, as I said, of the publication citations going up. People are talking more about what's going on, about the papers and studies in general. And another project maybe I can talk about is I'm working for a scientific panel which is concerned about plant nutrition. So they talk about, or they come up with actionable tips, actionable strategies on how to improve plant nutrition. And what they do is they write these so-called issue briefs, and they are very, very scientific. They are like literally just a scientific review. And they then kind of, when they told me about this at the first meeting that we had, they told me, hey, we want policymakers or industry, like people from the industry or from companies, to read these issue briefs. And I had to read through this, like, I don't even like reading this, I'm sorry. And I understand what's supposed to be in there. So let's make this nicer. So gladly I landed that position and helped them make these documents, nicer, more as I said, yeah, accessible for people that understand the topic. Obviously, they have the knowledge of the jargon, they understand this, but often it's just the writing that is just difficult to follow. So it's already, yeah, one key concept that I always talk about: make the writing nice. If you write nicely, people have it so much easier to follow actually your train of thoughts, like reading what you're talking about, and you already reach so many more people, because no one, I mean, I would never ask anyone to read a scientific study because no one wants to read that, mostly because of the writing. Yeah, so that's a second case study, I guess.
And so I'm just curious to understand a bit about, what you were describing there is sort of a difference in understanding, let's say, in how engaging some of the original text is, and how much work is in, I think I can guess here, but how much work is really involved in that, in terms of at least even convincing that that's not going to work, let's say, like it really needs to be even, further beyond, what someone might expect.
I think that's kind of what I said at the beginning. It's many people, many scientists know that their writing is not that good, but they just don't want to change it. They don't care. They can't be bothered to make it nicer, because when I tell them, hey, I'm going to help you rewrite that blog post, they were like, okay, here it is. It's like, professor telling their students, make this work, and then they just rely on someone else is doing this. Even though they know it's important, but yeah, it's just, if they can't be bothered, I mean, I can't push them. Then it's just up to me of how much I want to, yeah, push them, make it nicer, and make it more accessible and engaging. But yeah, it's, yeah.
And I think as well, I don't think we'll have time to cover it today, unfortunately, but I think the other thing that would be really interesting to have a longer session about is the way that people engage with different formats, how important things like video become now, animations become, versus written text, let's say. And I can be honest and say I engage much better with a video than I do with a written piece for some reason. And so I don't know if anyone quickly wanted to comment on that, just around like the significance of formats and how much we should be really aware of those.
Yes, so I mean, I get asked a lot because I'm writing my blog. That was kind of my first communication project that I started still as a research scientist, and people told me, Sarah, I really don't like reading. Can you make a video blog? I'm like, I'm not a video person. I'm not someone who likes making designs and all of this. I'm okay with having a little illustration once in a while, but otherwise I'm a writer and I'm a reader. So with me, if I have a question in Google, I will always go for the blog post instead of the video, just because that's how I am. But I understand that people will never read through my blog post just because they prefer having a video, having everything explained to them. So yeah, obviously that's a completely different road for public access. And I mean, even videos, infographics, like illustrations. I mean, many journals now have these graphical abstracts as well that they asked for, which is already helping for those people that are more visually engaged. So that's a step forward for that as well. But I'm sure there's, as you said, there's a whole discussion behind that as well.
Yeah, and I think what you're describing quite nicely there, though, is that even whether it be the written text or whether it be animations or visual representations, is science communication feels much more of an art than a science, let's say. And I think, that's something that people need to be really aware of. It's not something which everyone can just do, because you understand the science doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be able to communicate that effectively. And I think, in trying to increase public, we really need to get that right. Just one other question I wanted to ask on this topic, and I'll put this for any panelist who's feeling brave, let's say, because I think it's a tricky topic, but what role does social media play in all of this? Either positive or negative, let's say. I mean, I think we can say translation, we've talked about, is a problem, that needs to be overcome. There's the dissemination point as well, in that, arguably, I mean, lay summaries, I think Beth mentioned earlier on, are one way that we can translate, but it does require the user to go to the same location, whereas actually I think dissemination and trying to push this out into channels is something which is also probably really required. And social media offers a route, but I think we all know comes with some significant challenges. I wonder, would anyone like to comment on that and have a view on the role social media should play, could play, shouldn't play?
I mean, there is something that is worth possibly mentioning, so people might be interested in it, that there was a paper that came out this week where somebody looked at citation advantage actually for papers that had been tweeted about, because it's one of the things that we've always said in libraries, oh yes, tweet about your papers, other researchers will read it, you'll get cited more, all of this. And actually they found that they didn't really find much citation advantage at all. They couldn't find anything statistic, but what they did find was that there was a lot more downloads of papers that had been tweeted about. And what the authors are suggesting is that actually it is much more, of a kind of public download, and maybe it's professionals or whatever, but it's not that Twitter was increasing the academic engagement, because academics are going to engage or not engage with the paper anyway. They've already got routes to that, but actually that this paper was showing that it was improving public access. So I do think that it has a good route to it. I think the other thing, given that we talk about trust quite a lot, is quite interesting in that researchers will pick up papers that they believe should not be trusted and talk about them ad nauseum on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever. And actually, and that's a link to open access, that open access has allowed the light to be shined on these papers, and then social media allows that to be broadcast. And so in a way, in some areas that means that it's much more obvious to the public that there are these issues. These issues aren't new, they were always there, but now they're really obvious. But equally, there's nowhere to hide for those papers because they're being broadcast. So I'm a big social media fan, but obviously it does have its problems.
So I mean, what you're definitely saying there is it can be a means for good in terms of, like, we should make sure we don't write that off too quickly, despite some of the challenges. Hannah, you look like you're about to speak.
Yeah, sorry, I'm on my phone, so yes, my finger does get in the way every time I want to unmute myself. Yeah, I think Beth made some great points there. For me, social media, it's in part about who you're trying to reach. Like, why are you communicating this paper, and are these people that you're trying to reach going to be in that space? Because sometimes they won't be, and in that case, there's no reason to promote it on social media. So yeah, I think it can be really positive, but equally, you need to think about whether the thing that you're trying to promote is in the right format, and whether the people will be there to receive your promotion. And I think sometimes, when we're thinking about the value of openness in terms of delivering impacts and that translational element, trying to reach the technologies, the business innovator angle of publics, that they're not necessarily going to be on social media. You might need to find some kind of venture capital hub or different places to go. I also, the other thing that fascinates me about social media is that researchers are really happy to take papers down and point out fallacies with papers on social media, but they will not use the comment function on journal articles or preprints or publishing platforms. I mean, for me, this is like a fascinating piece of social research as to the academic norms and values. Yeah, absolutely fascinates me as to why they don't feel able to use those functions that many publishers provide.
Yeah, no, that is interesting. Yeah, the general behaviours. But
Christian, could I? Yeah,
please,
if I could jump in on the social media question, because I really appreciate Beth's and Hannah's comments here, and want to agree with them. But I also want to point out that social media is also an enormous vector for misinformation on the topics that we care about, and really take a minute to emphasize that. And it's not just misinformation from some kind of, you know, cosmic background radiation of people. There's intentional bad actors, whether they are domestic political actors in some of our countries. But you know, I think it would be irresponsible for us not to take a moment to acknowledge that social media is one of a number of vectors where foreign adversaries are maleficently trying to attack our social cohesion in the countries that we here on this panel represent. And I think that, you know, it's that's not the only vector that they're trying to do that through. But, you know, I think we've seen, certainly in the United States, I'm not sure how this works elsewhere, of, you know, some of the enormous problems that TikTok has caused for us, whether they be intentional or happenstance. You know, the dynamics are incredibly worrisome. And so, you know, for countries that are going into an election season right now and thinking about like the catastrophic impacts of a disinformation environment that is intentionally caused by foreign actors, whether it was about healthcare during you know, the height of the pandemic, or you know, other topics today. I think you know, it's not just a question of like, can the scientists get their word out or their downloads up? I mean, I think those things are important, don't get me wrong, but it's like, how do we think about these spaces and think about how to build resilience for the things that actually matter, which, you know, for our purposes today, I would argue is trust in science. So, so sorry to over dramatize, perhaps it sounds like to some, but I think it's actually quite a serious issue.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right to bring that up, Roger, I think. Absolutely.
And I think it comes back to the point, perhaps, which you were making earlier on as well, is that there are people that are actively working to undermine trust in science, let's say, on an active basis, you know, and so that's in social media, but it's in other places as well. And I think, yeah, I'm sure this is the same debate that lots of people have about social media. It can certainly be a means for good. It can certainly be a means for bad as well. And I guess, you know, perhaps one thing we can definitely say, though, is that, you know, there's never a reason not to try and get as much trusted information out there, because as many people will be trying to put untrusted information out there as well. But I think there is also the challenge that comes with it, is that the way that communication happens on social media is so clipped, would we say, that actually the idea of trying to get across correct points for very complicated areas can be incredibly challenging, I think, but really, really important, you know. And I think all of these pieces added together really talk about public engagement being, you know, a very active process, and something which needs the right skill set and a really active involvement, rather than anything that we can just expect will happen because things are suddenly freely available. And, you know, I've noticed that Fran's appeared, which is my actually, I'm supposed to, I think, wrap up our talk, because we're going to go to questions from the room. And there was a further question we wanted to come on to about responsibility, but I think actually we've got to quite a nice point from the conversation there. And Fran, perhaps we should pause there and hand over for questions from the room, because we only have 15 minutes left, I think, for today.
Yes, sorry everybody. It was a really interesting conversation here. I didn't want to interrupt, but we had a few questions. Some of them were sent in before you actually touched upon this topics on the subject. So I'm just going to go through them, and then you can decide, maybe Chris, which one you would like to pick up. And there's also a couple of questions specifically for Sarah, and I think maybe Hannah or Beth, that maybe we can pick up later. Maybe you can answer, you know, in writing, like we asked other panelists. The time is very short, so maybe we can gather some of the questions, send them to you, and if you would like to reply in writing, then we can put them together in a nice blog. And yeah, so one of the questions was about responsibility. So we had, if funding bodies are using our tax dollars, well, we know where the question came from, to back open policies, saying it's all for giving us access to knowledge, aren't we kind of messing up by not putting some of that cash into making science easier to get? Whose responsibility should it be? So this is one question. Then another two are referring to AI. So one is, what kind of role can AI potentially play in supporting science communication? And a different one, would AI LLMs act as a new venue for research outlets in a new way or another? And then finally, we also have another one about ethics. What about ethics and integrity issues nowadays? OA journals suffer a lot. Why and how to fix it? And then once connected to this, how do we ensure the integrity of materials aimed at the general public, particularly where we might be communicating topics related to public health, for example? So we have AI, ethics, and then responsibility.
Okay, well, I mean, unless the panelists have a preference, I wonder if we might pick up that question of responsibility, given it was one that we perhaps hoped to cover. I mean, I guess we've talked about that there's a particular skill set that might be required to deliver science communication, but on that question of responsibility, whose responsibility should it be to make sure that that happens? Hannah, I wonder if maybe from the Wellcome Trust perspective, like, do you have a kind of, we're talking here about kind of public engagement, but who do you kind of hold responsible for making sure that the requirements of your funding are upheld, if you like? So if someone doesn't meet the requirements, who do you see as responsible? Is it a researcher? Is it an institution?
So it depends on what angle of the kind of research practice policies it is. Sometimes it's the researcher, though often that falls because researchers may move on to another institution that it may actually fall with the institution. So, for example, in the case of making journal or books open access, that can often come back to the institution in the absence of the researcher. But then equally, when it comes to the engagement angles, I think it's a broader suite. You know, as funders of research, we need to see evidence that the research is ethical and is engaged and aligns with, you know, I guess at least norms, or has set out plans to go and engage as part of that research proposal. Then there's the involvement of ethics boards, there's the place of lived experience, so that the researcher does have a role to play in that, and, you know, all the support staff that can enable that, from science communicators to community managers, you know, those are all people who can be funded through grants and part of grants. And then at the outcomes part, you know, there's a role for the venues where the research is being communicated to check that, you know, perhaps appropriate ethical requirements have been followed, but then equally for institution and funders, and again thinking about whether the ambitions of the research were met and delivered as appropriate when it comes to reflecting on future funding.
Okay, so a kind of broad, there's a range of different activities there and a range of different people that you hold responsible for that, I guess.
Yeah. I think we all have a responsibility to contribute towards this, but it's, you know, for some of us it will be on the micro level, and for others it will be on a macro. And I do think that, you know, researchers do have a responsibility to do trustworthy research, but they need educating, I think, in what that means. You know, I was allowed to go through my science degree without studying the philosophy and history of science, which I've then spent the last, you know, X number of years learning about, because it felt like a great gap in my ability to work in this area. I can't imagine I'm the only one who has that gap working in research.
Yeah. Other perspectives from the panel? Anyone wanted to add on the idea of responsibility around this? Beth?
Yeah, so I mean, I totally agree that I think, you know, researchers are responsible for this in a kind of overview way. You know, they take the money to do the research, it's written into their contract, they need to be doing it. And sometimes you know, researchers don't really like all the things that are written into their contracts, but don't want to do it, they just want to do the science. But I do feel very strongly for the researchers who are very good at the science that they do. They have been trained for decades in how to do the science. What they have not been trained in for decades in is public communication, and that's not what they went in to do. They didn't do a degree in public communication, they did a degree in microbiology or whatever. And to then kind of, for us to come along at this sort of slightly late stage in their career, maybe if they're, you know, in their 40s or 50s or whatever, and say, oh, now you have to have this entirely new set of skills, please go out and talk to children about your research. I think that's slightly unfair in lots of ways. And so I do think that institutions have a really big responsibility to make sure that they are enabling that public access and, you know, funding professionals, providing routes for researchers to talk to those professionals. And the researchers do have to talk to them, you know, they have to explain it part way. But I think it's not fair to just kind of dump this on researchers and say, yeah, absolutely, the public now needs to understand what you're doing, go out and tell them about it.
I think that's a really interesting point. Like just saying to someone, go and do some, it's like, well, what would I do if someone put that in front of me? You know, it's not just something that always comes naturally. And I guess perhaps you're saying that even though there might be a responsibility on the researcher, given that they accepted the funding in the first instance, it's unreasonable to expect them to be able to deliver that necessarily, and they'll need the support of others on that topic. But any other views on responsibilities?
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that has been said about this whole topic so far. I think it's a shared responsibility of the funders, the institution, but maybe also of the publishing house, of where, like, a publishing journal, and the scientist, obviously. As I said, a lot of institutions or publishing houses now have some kind of communications team, some kind of communication strategies for any publications. So be it a blog or like a monthly email newsletter. I think some publishing houses still print their monthly journals, I'm not sure. But there's definitely lots of platforms where scientists can share their research on, or their projects. So it's easy for them to get into contact with them. Then obviously the question is, however, whether they want to do the communication themselves. As I said, we can't push them. If someone doesn't like writing about their research paper in a sorry, I don't like saying that, but in a lay way, we can't make them. So this is when science writers need to come in, and either these are from the institution themselves or they are freelance science writers. But then the question is, who pays them? Because obviously, I mean, I need to get paid somehow for my work. Where does this money come from? Does that come from the funding body? Or I think it should, because as you said before, if they fund the whole research project in general, it should also involve the communication part of the whole research project. So yeah, as I said, everything comes together. Everybody should do their own part in sharing the science in the end.
So I'd like to just briefly build on some of the comments that have been offered already here, and maybe add an additional perspective, which it seems to me that if we think about public access, the public part of public access, the general public part of public access, we have an increasingly, we have a very, very changing marketplace for how that gets provided, right? So if you think back 20 years or something like that, individuals who were interested in science would read science journalism from a variety of different newspapers. They would maybe subscribe to some general science magazines that they would seek to gather information from. I don't think we have a highly effective functioning marketplace today for certain kinds of science communication or public access of the type that I really want to center on here. So I would raise the question, this is a question for funders, for governments, for whoever it is out there who cares about the public good on these issues. And I don't think individual scientists need to care about the public good on these issues. I certainly don't think individual universities necessarily need to. I think the institutions that are charged with centering on the public good need to make sure that there's a functioning marketplace and an effective set of incentives that motivate the right kinds of, whether it be distillation, translation, communication, journalism, whatever those things are that we need. And I think that that's been, as I touched on a little bit earlier, I think certainly in the United States, sorely lacking from our public access work thus far. And I really do hope that funders and governments will take that kind of perspective on board.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that, I mean, all of those comments, I think, come together really nicely. I mean, I think what it describes is, I'm not sure who, one of you said it first, but you probably all said it in one way or another, is that we've all got a responsibility within this space, to make sure that it happens, to make it easy for it to happen, to be able to make sure that it's funded properly, let's say, and it's given a proper focus, and, there's not just an expectation that it's something that will happen at the end out of, because someone feels like they should probably do something. It's a really active part of the process. And I think even as we touched on earlier on, it's at the start as well as at the end. And I can see Fran's got her hand up, so I should probably just check what she was going to say.
Yeah, sorry, but we had a couple of questions coming in that are very interesting. So I know that we're wrapping up, so we only have 5 minutes. So I don't know if you want to answer very quickly one of you this. So one is that, how do we think this type of communication might change in the future as the so-called digital natives start coming to the research space? So this is one question, which I think is very interesting. And the other one, actually, it's about how do you see the challenges for communication across subjects? Discussing science tends to bring up STEM subjects, but social sciences research often has easier access and impact points. Mm-hmm. I think we can wrap up with something like this.
So the second question was about interdisciplinary communication, I think, wasn't it? And the first one,
yeah,
I slightly lost the sound. There was one point that you said, I think it was about digital native, I think?
Yeah. So how do we think this type of communication might change in the future as the so-called digital natives start coming to the research space? So it's a different generation used to digital everything.
Who feels like offering an opinion on either of those questions would be fine to talk on?
We can pick it up. We can pick it up in a blog afterwards. But I think maybe some, yeah.
I think that the term digital native is difficult because actually those digital natives are often not as familiar with digital media as, say, millennials are, because they haven't grown up with it being developed. And a lot of the time, so you talked about TikTok earlier, and a lot of the time they will just mindlessly consume a lot of the digital media that's out there without necessarily critically appraising it. So as a librarian, critical literacy is something that's incredibly important, and in terms of media is going to be even more so as these digital natives, don't like that term, but come into being. And I think it is a slightly different thing, but we've always dealt with information literacy. We're still dealing with information literacy. We're just slightly changing the media.
That's a really good point. Yeah, and I think it's a challenge we've always had to work with in one way or another. It's just that the media changes. But I'm really conscious of time because I don't want to make sure that we don't keep our speakers any longer than we should do. So I'll hand over to Fran to wrap up properly. But I'd just say, it's been great. I really enjoyed this, and what a great panel we've had to discuss it. I'm really grateful for all of the views. I think we probably could have doubled the time and still had much longer to talk about it. So I'll hand back over to Fran, but I'll say thank you very much to everyone from my side anyway for your points, and also for the audience for listening anyway.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to all of you and the panels, our speakers. Thank you, Chris, for moderating this so well. And thank you all for attending today's event. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting such an interesting panel. And please remember to fill in the survey in the email you will be receiving today, as we would love to hear your feedback. Also on the topics and any interesting speakers like the one we had today that you might know or recommend. And of course, feel free to subscribe to know more about the next events in this series. And also, should you have any questions at all for the speakers or about open access and science communication, since we had quite a few specific one in the chat, please feel free to write to me. And I'm just going to leave now my email on the screen so you can check it out, but you also will receive an email. So yeah, stay up to date. Please, yeah, write us an email or yeah, contact us, and we will put together all the questions that you might have and then let our speakers answer. So thank you again, and until next time.